The morning sunlight streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across Judge Henderson's polished wooden desk. He sat there in his chambers, flipping through case files with the casual indifference that comes from handling thousands of similar cases over 15 years on the bench. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten among the scattered papers and manila folders that mapped out the day ahead. The judge's routine was as predictable as the sunrise. Arrive at 7:30 a.m., review the day's cases by 8:45, and be on the bench by 9 o'clock sharp. Today was no different, except perhaps for the slight headache lingering from his country club dinner the night before, where he'd spent hours discussing property values and local politics with his usual circle of friends. As he shuffled through the morning's traffic court cases, his eyes barely skimmed the names. After so many years, he'd developed what he called judicial intuition, a gut feeling about cases before they even began. His colleagues praised his quick decision-making, but none dared to question whether these snap judgments might come from somewhere less admirable than experience. The courthouse was coming alive around him. He could hear the familiar sounds, the security guards changing shifts, the click of heels on marble floors as the court clerk made her morning rounds, and the distant hum of the ancient heating system fighting off the morning chill. These sounds had become the backdrop to his life, as familiar as his own heartbeat. His secretary knocked gently on the door, bringing in a fresh stack of files that had just arrived. 23 cases today, she mentioned, placing them carefully on his desk, mostly traffic violations and minor disputes. The judge nodded, barely looking up. In his mind, traffic court was merely a necessary evil, a tedious parade of excuses and sob stories that kept him from the more interesting cases he'd rather be handling. Little did he know that today's seemingly routine docket would force him to question everything he thought he knew about himself and his approach to justice. As he reached for another case file, his gold cufflinks catching the morning light, he had no idea that in just a few hours, his carefully constructed world of assumptions and unexamined biases would begin to crumble. The courthouse lobby below was already filling with people, some nervous, others resigned, all waiting for their moment before the bench. Among them was someone who would challenge not just a traffic ticket, but the very foundations of how justice was administered in this courtroom. But for now, Judge Henderson simply straightened his bow tie, adjusted his reading glasses, and continued his morning ritual, completely unaware that this ordinary Tuesday would become one of the most significant days of his career. His chamber walls were lined with diplomas, certificates, and awards. 15 years' worth of recognition that had, perhaps unknowingly, reinforced his belief in his own infallibility. A large photograph hung prominently behind his desk, showing him shaking hands with the state governor at his judicial appointment ceremony. It was a moment of pride that now seemed to watch over every decision he made, though sometimes pride can blind us to our own shortcomings. As he signed off on the last few pre-trial motions, the clock on his wall ticked steadily toward 9. Soon, he would don his black robe and assume his position of authority, ready to dispense what he believed was fair and impartial justice. But sometimes, life has a way of showing us that our beliefs about ourselves don't always match reality. The autumn evening was just settling in, streetlights flickering to life, one by one along Oak Avenue. A silver BMW, polished and well-maintained, cruised smoothly through the residential neighborhood. Behind the wheel sat a man in his mid-30s, his suit jacket carefully hung in the back seat, tie loosened after a long day in federal court. He'd just wrapped up an important case and was heading to pick up his daughter from her piano lessons. The car's dashboard clock showed 6:45 p.m. He was running a bit late. His daughter's piano teacher was understanding, but he prided himself on punctuality. As he approached the intersection near Maple Elementary School, he came to a complete stop, carefully checking both directions. The streets were quiet, with just a few kids riding their bikes home from after-school activities. In his rearview mirror, he noticed the flash of red and blue lights. His heart sank slightly, not from guilt, but from experience. As a federal prosecutor, He knew all too well how these situations could go. He followed the protocol he'd advised countless others to use. Turn on interior lights, keep hands visible on the steering wheel, and remain calm. The police cruiser pulled up behind him, its lights painting the street in alternating colors. The officer approached, flashlight beams sweeping across the car's interior. License and registration. Came the gruff request, without any greeting or explanation for the stop. The prosecutor complied calmly, movements deliberate and measured. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, studying the license with extra attention. The prosecutor politely replied that he didn't, knowing he'd made a complete stop at the sign. The officer's response came with an edge. "You rolled through that stop sign back there. This is a school zone." The prosecutor knew this wasn't true. He'd been especially careful, as he always was in school zones. He also knew there was a traffic camera at that intersection, evidence that would later prove crucial. But for now, he remained composed, drawing on years of courtroom experience to keep his voice steady and professional. "Officer," he began respectfully, "I'm certain I came to a complete stop. I always do, especially in school zones." He noticed the officer's hand tighten slightly on his notepad. The tension in the air grew thicker, like storm clouds gathering before rain. The ticket, when it came, showed a fine of $300, significantly higher than the standard rate for a stop sign violation. The officer's explanation was curt. School zone violations carry enhanced penalties, but the prosecutor knew the local traffic laws like the back of his hand. This fine was well above the normal range, even for school zones. As the officer walked back to his cruiser, the prosecutor sat quietly, the ticket feeling heavy in his hands. His daughter would be wondering where he was by now. He pulled out his phone to text her piano teacher, apologizing for the delay. The response came quickly. "No worries, she's practicing her scales." Looking at the ticket under the dome light, he made a decision. This wasn't just about him anymore. As someone who dedicated his life to justice, he had a responsibility to challenge unfair treatment, not just for himself, but for everyone who might face similar situations without his legal knowledge and resources. His daughter's piano lesson would have to wait a few more minutes. He carefully documented everything, taking photos of the intersection, noting the exact time, and sending himself an email with all the details while they were fresh in his mind. Years of prosecuting cases had taught him the value of thorough documentation. The sun had fully set now, and the street lamps cast long shadows across the pavement. As he finally pulled away from the curb, he was already mentally preparing for what would come next. Tomorrow, he would request the traffic camera footage and file a formal contest to the ticket. But for now, he had a piano lesson to get to, and a daughter who was probably wondering why her usually punctual father was running so late. The morning sun painted long rectangles on the courthouse floor as people filed into traffic courtroom 302. The prosecutor had chosen to wear a simple charcoal suit today, professional but understated. He'd left his usual power tie and federal prosecutor's badge at home. After 20 years of courtroom experience, he knew appearances could speak louder than words. He sat quietly in the back row, watching other cases being processed with assembly line efficiency. Judge Henderson barely looked up as he handed down fines and dismissed explanations. Guilty, $120. Guilty, $150. Next case. The judge's gavel punctuated each decision like a metronome keeping time. The prosecutor observed how different defendants were treated. A well-dressed businessman got his fine reduced after a brief explanation. A teenage girl in tears was given stern advice, but allowed to take a driver's education course instead of paying a fine. The patterns were clear to his trained eye. His case number was called TC 2024-472. As he walked to the podium, he could feel the weight of eyes following him. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and somewhere in the back of the courtroom, a baby started fussing. He placed his documents neatly on the podium, squared his shoulders, and waited. Judge Henderson glanced at the citation, then at him, then back at the citation. You're contesting a stop sign violation in a school zone. The judge's tone carried that familiar edge of impatience. Yes, Your Honor, the prosecutor replied quietly, maintaining perfect courtroom composure. The fine is $300. Do you have a compelling reason why we shouldn't double it for wasting the court's time? The judge's pen was already moving toward the paper, ready to write the increased amount. The prosecutor noticed how the judge hadn't even asked for his side of the story. The courtroom had grown quieter. The usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations had died down. Even the baby in the back had stopped crying. It was as if everyone could sense something unusual was about to happen. Your Honor, the prosecutor began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had stood before hundreds of judges. I'd like to present evidence that I did, in fact, come to a complete stop. I have the traffic camera footage here, and the judge cut him off. The officer's word is sufficient. The fine is now $600 for contesting a clear violation. The gavel started to rise. That's when the back door of the courtroom opened. A tall woman in a crisp suit walked in, the district attorney herself. "Good morning, Judge Henderson," she called out. "I see my lead federal prosecutor is here. I hope there hasn't been any misunderstanding." The silence in the courtroom grew deeper. Judge Henderson's gavel stopped midair. His eyes darted from the DA to the prosecutor and back again. The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable, like watching ice crack on a frozen pond. The prosecutor remained perfectly still, his face neutral. Years of high-stakes federal cases had taught him the power of silence in moments like these. He watched as the judge's earlier certainty began to crumble, replaced by the first flickers of realization. The other people in the courtroom had stopped pretending to look at their phones or papers. Everyone was watching now, sensing they were witnessing something significant. The judge's clerk had even stopped typing, her hands frozen above her keyboard. Judge Henderson cleared his throat, but for the first time that morning, words seemed to fail him. The prosecutor waited patiently, his evidence still neatly arranged on the podium, his posture relaxed but professional. The next few moments would determine not just the outcome of a simple traffic ticket, but perhaps something much more important about justice and assumptions in room 302. The atmosphere in courtroom 302 had transformed from routine morning traffic court to something entirely different. The district attorney's presence seemed to fill the room, her words still echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "My lead federal prosecutor." Those words hung in the air like visible things. The prosecutor remained at the podium, calm and collected, though inside he felt a mix of emotions he'd rarely experienced in his years of courtroom work. He'd handled murder cases, international drug rings, and corruption charges, but this moment felt uniquely personal. "Your Honor," he began again, his voice carrying the weight of his 15 years of federal court experience. "I have here the traffic camera footage from the intersection of Oak and Maple." He gestured to the laptop he brought, now set up on the podium. "Would the court like to review it?" Judge Henderson's face had gone through several subtle changes in the past few minutes, from dismissive to surprised, then to something approaching concern. The judge's hands, which had been firmly gripping his gavel, now rested flat on the bench. The morning light streaming through the high windows caught the gold ring on his left hand, making it glint nervously as his fingers twitched. "I also have here," the prosecutor continued professionally, "my credentials from the federal prosecutor's office, where I've served as lead prosecutor on several cases you may be familiar with." He began listing them quietly, cases that had made headlines, cases that had changed laws, cases that Judge Henderson had undoubtedly read about over his morning coffee. The other people waiting for their cases to be heard had abandoned any pretense of disinterest. A young woman in the back row was typing frantically on her phone, probably sharing the unfolding drama on social media. The court clerk had stopped shuffling papers, her usual busy movements stilled by the tension in the air. The district attorney moved forward, her heels clicking decisively on the marble floor. "Judge Henderson, I can personally vouch for his outstanding record. He's currently leading our task force on judicial reform and fair sentencing practices. She placed her own credentials on the bench, though they weren't necessary. Everyone in the legal community knew who she was. Judge Henderson's face had taken on the look of someone who had just discovered their house was built on shifting sand. He picked up the traffic citation with hands that weren't quite steady, reading it again as if seeing it for the first time. The excessive fine amounts seemed to stand out on the page like an accusation. The prosecutor waited patiently, his posture remaining professional and respectful. He'd spent years teaching younger lawyers about courtroom demeanor, about maintaining dignity even in challenging moments. Now he was living those lessons in a way he hadn't expected. From the gallery, whispers had started to circulate. Someone recognized him from a recent high-profile case. Another person was quietly explaining his reputation to their seatmate. The morning sunlight continued its slow crawl across the courtroom floor, marking the passage of these tense moments. The court officer stood slightly straighter, sensing the shift in power dynamics. The judge's clerk had started a new page in her notes, perhaps understanding that this case would require special documentation. Even the American flag behind the judge seemed to hang more solemnly in the still air of the courtroom. Judge Henderson cleared his throat, finally breaking the weighted silence. The next words he would speak would be crucial, not just for this case, but for the reputation of his court and perhaps for his own understanding of justice. The prosecutor stood ready, his evidence organized, his case prepared, embodying the very principles of justice that this courthouse was meant to uphold. Judge Henderson felt the comfortable world of his courtroom crumbling around him. The familiar weight of his black robe suddenly felt heavy on his shoulders, like armor that had failed to protect him. He looked down at his hands spread flat on the bench, trying to gather his thoughts as 15 years of assumptions began to unravel. The traffic camera footage played silently on the laptop screen before him. Clear as day, it showed the prosecutor's car coming to a complete, proper stop at the intersection. 3 seconds at the stop sign. By the book, exactly as it should be. The judge watched it twice, though once would have been enough. His mind raced back through the morning's cases. How many others had he judged without really looking? How many fines had he doubled without proper cause? The young mother who tried to explain about her sick child, the elderly man with the expired registration who'd attempted to show his fixed income documents, their faces now floated in his memory with new clarity. The courtroom remained hushed, waiting. The prosecutor stood quietly at the podium, his demeanor professional, but his eyes holding a challenge that the judge couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. It was about something far more fundamental to justice itself. Through the high windows, clouds passed over the sun, briefly dimming the courtroom. In that moment of shadow, Judge Henderson remembered his own first day on the bench, the weight of responsibility he'd felt, the promises he'd made to himself about fairness and justice. Somewhere along the way, those ideals had gotten buried under routine and unconscious bias. The district attorney remained standing, her presence a reminder of the broader implications of this moment. The judge noticed how the other waiting defendants were watching intently, perhaps seeing for the first time that the system could be questioned, that authority could be challenged respectfully but firmly. His clerk was looking at him expectantly, pen poised over her notepad. The morning's earlier rhythm of rapid-fire judgments and quick fines seemed like a distant memory now. Each second of silence felt like an admission. Each moment of hesitation a small crack in the facade of infallibility he'd built around himself. Memories from his early career flashed through his mind. His passion for justice, his belief in the system's ability to serve everyone equally. He'd been proud of his quick decisions, his efficient courtroom. Now he wondered how many of those quick decisions had been based on prejudices he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. The prosecutor's case files lay open on the podium. Not just the traffic camera footage, but statistics about traffic stops, fine amounts, and conviction rates. The judge could see graphs and charts peeking out from the manila folder, data that he suspected would tell an uncomfortable story about patterns in his own courtroom. A baby's sudden cry from the back of the courtroom broke the tension momentarily. Judge Henderson looked up, seeing the young mother trying to quiet her child while anxiously watching the proceedings. He saw her differently now, not as another case number, but as a person seeking justice in his courtroom. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. His next words would matter, not just for this case, but for every case that would follow. The comfortable routine of his courtroom had been disrupted, and in that disruption lay an opportunity for change, for growth, for a return to the principles of justice he'd once held so dear. His hands moved to straighten his glasses, a nervous habit he'd developed over years on the bench. The morning sun had returned, streaming through the windows and illuminating the dust motes in the air. In that light, everything in his courtroom looked different, clearer, perhaps, than it had in years. The prosecutor took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as he prepared to address the court. His voice, when it came, was measured and clear, carrying the weight of both personal experience and professional authority. "Your Honor," he began, opening a thick folder filled with meticulously organized documents, "I'd like to present some information that goes beyond my individual case today." His fingers traced along the edge of a graph, charts and statistics laid out in neat rows before him. The courtroom remained silent, hanging on every word. Even the usual shuffling of papers had ceased. The young law clerk who normally spent her mornings scrolling through her phone was now leaning forward, pen poised over her notepad. "Over the past 5 years," the prosecutor continued, his voice steady, "I've observed a concerning pattern in traffic court fines." He lifted the first page, a color-coded chart that told its story in stark numbers and percentages. When controlling for identical violations, there's a significant disparity in fine amounts based on demographic factors. Judge Henderson's face remained carefully neutral, but his hands gripped the edge of his desk more tightly. The morning light streaming through the high windows seemed to spotlight the evidence being presented, making the numbers impossible to ignore. For the same stop sign violation, the prosecutor explained, turning to a new page, the average fine varies by as much as 200% depending on the driver's appearance and perceived status. His words carried no anger, just the steady weight of facts. "I have here documented cases, dates, and fine amounts that demonstrate this pattern." From the gallery, a soft murmur rose and fell. The district attorney, still standing near the front, nodded slightly. She'd seen these numbers before, had possibly been waiting for the right moment for them to come to light. The prosecutor pulled out another document, the traffic camera footage still frame showing his complete stop at the intersection. "This isn't about my ticket anymore, Your Honor. It's about ensuring that justice is truly blind in this courtroom." He laid out more evidence, photographs of the intersection, time-stamped footage, and most damning of all, a comprehensive analysis of fine distributions from the past 60 months. The numbers told their story without emotion or accusation, but their impact was undeniable. "These disparities," he continued, his voice growing softer but no less firm, "affect real people. The single mother who can't afford a double fine, the elderly gentleman living on fixed income, the student trying to make ends meet." He gestured to the packed gallery behind him, where dozens of people waited for their own cases to be heard. The judge's clerk had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keyboard as she watched the scene unfold. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, his usual stoic expression betraying a hint of understanding. "I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame," the prosecutor said, straightening the papers before him. "I'm here because this system can be better. Because it must be better." He placed a final document on the podium, a proposed set of guidelines for standardizing traffic fines based solely on the violation, not on who committed it. The silence in the courtroom had taken on a different quality now, not tense, but thoughtful. Through the windows, clouds passed over the sun, briefly dimming the room before brightness returned, as if nature itself was underlining the moment's importance. The prosecutor stood quietly, waiting. He'd said what needed to be said, presented what needed to be presented. Now it was time for the court to respond, for justice to prove it could correct its own course when confronted with truth. By late afternoon, the story had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. A young journalist who happened to be covering a different case had witnessed everything. Her article, published online within hours, carried the headline, "Federal Prosecutor Exposes Pattern of Bias in Local Traffic Court." The courthouse steps were buzzing with activity. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. The prosecutor walked calmly through the crowd, declining immediate comment with professional courtesy. He'd learned long ago that justice worked best when it moved at its own careful pace. Inside the courthouse break room, clerks and administrative staff huddled over their phones, reading the article that was quickly gaining traction. The story had struck a chord, not just because of what happened, but because of how it happened. A quiet, professional challenge to the system, backed by undeniable evidence. "Did you see the statistics?" one clerk whispered to another. 5 years of data. He must have been gathering evidence all this time. They scrolled through their phones, looking at the graphs that were now circulating online, showing the stark differences in fine amounts that couldn't be explained by anything other than bias. The district attorney's office was flooded with calls from other jurisdictions. Similar patterns had been suspected in other courtrooms, but no one had ever documented them so thoroughly. The morning's events had opened a door that couldn't be closed again. In his chambers, Judge Henderson sat alone, staring at his computer screen. His email inbox was filling up with messages from judicial colleagues, court administrators, and the media. The local news website's comments section under the article was growing by the minute, filled with stories from others who felt they'd faced similar treatment in traffic court. A young law student, who'd been interning at the courthouse, sat in the library, furiously taking notes. She'd witnessed something rare, a moment when the system was forced to look at itself in the mirror. Her professor had already asked her to prepare a presentation about it for next week's class. The courthouse security guards changed shifts, sharing updates about the growing crowd outside. Civil rights organizations had already announced plans for a peaceful gathering the next day. Signs were being made, social media hashtags were trending, and the local evening news was leading with the story. In the parking garage, 2 traffic court officers talked quietly by their cars. "Remember that woman last week?" one said. "The one with 3 kids who begged us to reduce her fine." They both fell silent, thinking about similar cases they'd seen over the years. The prosecutor's office had become a hub of activity. Other attorneys stopped by, some offering support, others seeking advice on how to address similar issues in their own cases. His phone kept buzzing with messages from colleagues across the country, asking for copies of his research methodology. As evening fell, the courthouse janitor wheeled his cart past courtroom 302. He paused for a moment, looking at the now empty judge's bench through the window in the door. In his 15 years of cleaning these halls, he'd seen countless people come through, worried about fines they couldn't afford. Tonight, the room seemed different somehow. Local community leaders began issuing statements, calling for a review of all traffic court procedures. The city council announced an emergency meeting to discuss standardized fine structures. What had started as one man's stand against an unfair ticket had sparked a much larger conversation about justice and equality. The story continued to spread, but not just as another scandal or controversy. Instead, it was being shared as an example of how change could happen, not through shouting or violence, but through careful documentation, professional presentation, and unwavering commitment to truth. That evening, Judge Henderson sat alone in his home office, surrounded by 15 years' worth of case files. His dinner grew cold on the desk beside him as he pored over old records, seeing them with new eyes. The table lamp cast a warm glow over stacks of papers that told a story he'd never wanted to read before. His wife had peeked in earlier, concerned by his unusual quietness. "You've barely said a word since you got home," she'd said. He couldn't find the words to explain how his world had shifted today. How do you tell someone that everything you thought you knew about yourself might be wrong? The judge picked up another file from 2019, a simple parking ticket that he'd doubled because the defendant's explanation had seemed disrespectful. Now, reading his own notes, he wondered about the tone he'd heard that day. Had it been disrespect, or just nervousness, fear, frustration? Outside his window, the neighborhood was settling into its nighttime routine. Kids were being called in for dinner, dogs were taking their last walks, and porch lights were flickering on one by one. Normal life continued while he sat wrestling with uncomfortable truths about himself. He opened his laptop, searching through years of his own rulings. Each case seemed to whisper something he'd missed before. A pattern emerged, not of deliberate cruelty, but of unconscious assumptions that had guided his decisions. The evidence was there in black and white. Different fines for the same violations, harsher penalties for some, leniency for others. His coffee cup had been refilled 3 times as he dug deeper into the records. A young man fined heavily for a broken taillight, while a business executive got a warning for the same offense. A woman whose registration was 2 days expired received a maximum fine, while another's 3-month lapse was dismissed with a reminder. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 10, its chimes echoing through the quiet house. The judge leaned back in his chair, removing his reading glasses to rub his tired eyes. On his desk sat a framed photo from his swearing-in ceremony, 15 years ago. He remembered the pride he'd felt that day, the certainty that he would be a fair and just judge. He pulled out his phone, looking at the news coverage of today's events. The comments section was filled with stories, hundreds of them, from people who'd appeared in his courtroom over the years. Some praised his fairness, but others told stories that made his stomach twist with recognition. His legal pad was now filled with notes, dates, case numbers, and patterns he couldn't ignore. The prosecutor's presentation had opened his eyes, but his own research confirmed everything. The bias wasn't in the law books that lined his office walls. It had been in him all along. Near midnight, his wife brought him a fresh cup of tea. She found him writing. Not excuses or defenses, but a plan. Pages of ideas for standardizing fines, removing subjective factors from penalties, requiring regular review of decisions for patterns of bias. His handwriting grew messier as the ideas flowed faster. The house creaked and settled in the night silence as he worked. From his window, he could see the courthouse clock tower illuminated downtown, a reminder of the responsibility he carried. Tomorrow, he would have to face his colleagues, his staff, and more importantly, the public he served. A photo of his own father, also a judge, watched from the wall. He remembered his father's words about justice being blind. But being blind, he now realized, doesn't mean ignoring what's right in front of you. It means seeing everyone with the same clear eyes. 3 months later, courtroom 302 looked different. Gone were the rushed judgments and quick dismissals. A new electronic display showed standardized fine amounts, leaving no room for subjective interpretation. Each case now received the time it deserved, with proper consideration of evidence and circumstances. The prosecutor sat in the back row, observing the changes he'd helped create. He watched as a young delivery driver presented evidence about a disputed parking ticket. The judge listened carefully, reviewed the photographs, and made his decision based on clear, published guidelines that hung on the courtroom wall. The courthouse staff had adapted to the new procedures. The clerk's desk now had a laminated chart showing exact fine amounts for each violation. No more guessing, no more variations. Justice had become more transparent, more consistent, and most importantly, more fair. Judge Henderson stood at his bench, different from the man he'd been 3 months ago. His voice carried a new kind of authority, not from power, but from humility and understanding. He'd spent weeks working with community leaders, legal experts, and civil rights organizations to develop a better system. The morning's cases moved smoothly, each decision explained clearly and documented thoroughly. Body camera footage was reviewed when available. Traffic camera evidence was considered standard procedure. The days of the officer's word is sufficient were over in this courtroom. In the gallery, law students took notes. This courthouse had become a model for others, a case study in how to recognize and correct systemic bias. The judge had turned his moment of shame into an opportunity for real change, earning respect not by demanding it, but by showing he deserved it. The prosecutor's original traffic ticket hung framed in the courthouse lobby, alongside the new guidelines it had inspired. Below it, a simple plaque read, "Justice sees no differences except those written in law." It had become a talking point for tour groups and a reminder to everyone who worked there. During the lunch break, Judge Henderson met with other judges who had come to observe the new system. They sat in his chambers, discussing how to implement similar changes in their own courtrooms. The ripple effect was spreading, one courthouse at a time. The prosecutor had received countless calls from legal professionals across the country, asking about his methodology and documentation. But he was most proud of the local impact. The single parents who could now afford their fines through payment plans, the students who weren't forced to choose between traffic tickets and textbooks. As afternoon session began, a grandmother stood before the judge, nervous about her expired registration ticket. The judge listened to her explanation about living on Social Security, checked the standardized fine chart, and worked out a manageable payment schedule. The relief on her face spoke volumes about the impact of fair treatment. The day wound down with a meeting between the judge, the prosecutor, and community representatives. They reviewed the first quarter's data under the new system. The numbers told a clear story. Equal treatment had become more than just a phrase on the courthouse wall. Outside, the setting sun painted the courthouse columns in warm light. People left their hearings feeling heard. Whether they'd won or lost their cases, justice wasn't perfect, but it was better. As the judge gathered his papers to leave, he paused to straighten the new mission statement that hung behind his bench. Every case is important. Every person deserves respect. Every decision must be just.